getting the pressing the big blue button, that very scary moment. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in person and virtually. As you may see and notice, you're very well on the ground floor, and so we had to do a slight rearrangement, but we're very grateful for KYC to be able to accommodate us downstairs. I think it's a little cozier, and I quite like it. Bar's not too far away, so please take advantage of that. As usual, a little bit of housekeeping to start. If anyone's joining us virtually, please feel free to use the chat function. We'd love to know where you're joining us from. We'd also love for you to engage as much as possible through questions, so feel free to use the chat function to send those questions in. If that isn't working, we will put an email address in the chat for you to send questions to, but that email address is marmus@marmuseum.ca. That's marmus@marmuseum.ca. So, back for season 7, episode 2 of Nautical Nights, with a speaker alumnus that I think we're all quite familiar with, and so we're very grateful to have David Moore back. Before we get started, I would also like to thank Kingston Yacht Club once again for partnering with us on the speaker series and hosting us at their space. Pretty soon, maybe at the Marine Museum, but I think it's very nice to have that food and drink option available to us. The waterways and land located within the Great Lakes catchment area have a long history predating the establishment of European settlements. The waterways in particular are to be acknowledged as the traditional trade routes of Indigenous peoples, together providing a network of trade and travel routes essential to communities since time immemorial. The Great Lakes Museum acknowledges the site it sits on and the water it interacts with to be the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy and the Huron-Wendat peoples. We thank these nations for their care and stewardship of this land and water, and we are committed to sharing this stewardship moving forward. In our second installment of Nautical Nights, we're exploring the history of schooner women. Some of you may recall a presentation we had previously, but more of a storytelling with this book's falling down somewhere, with a presentation by Suzanne, thank you, Suzanne Pasternak, in the story of Minerva. And so I think this will be a great fitting. It's upstairs. Okay, goodness. Fitting continuation of that story and the work that Suzanne was doing in previous years. And so I'm very much looking forward to having David Moore come back and talk to us a bit more about schooner women and the history of women on the Great Lakes, because that's a topic we don't often hear about, and I'm a little biased, but I think that it deserves talking about. So you all very well know David Moore. He's a speaker alumnus, been with us. We've had him back a number of times, and I think he needs no introduction, but I would like to like you to join me in welcoming Dr. David Moore to our presentation this evening.
Thanks, Michelle. It's lovely to be back. As Walter Lewis Thu is back tonight to listen, I'm very, very honored to say, as he said 2 weeks ago, it is an honor to be invited to speak in this series to the audience from the museum and the club, but it's even more of an honor to be invited back. So I am invited back, and this is a topic I think that certainly, as Michelle said, deserves recognition and has not received much. In fact, women on the oceans in general have not received much attention, and I'll talk a bit about why that might be today. This is a great quote that I always introduce. I use often to introduce my talks from Rudyard Kipling back around 1889 or so. He was traveling around North America, and he wrote letters to his family, which he later published. And this is when he wrote about Lake Superior. But I think it absolutely applies to all the Great Lakes. As Rudyard Kipling found, a ocean-sized body of fresh water is a hideous thing to find in the center of a continent. And it is indeed ocean-sized. Sorry, the glares. I'll keep my finger on it. So this is a painting that a couple of years ago, a Nautical Nights speaker, Maurice Smith and Andy Soper talked about, done by a local maritime artist named Nicholas Henderson. And that's a view of the schooners arriving loaded with grain in the fall at harvest season. And they all came at once, and typically speaking, because the harvest all ripened at once. And so there's a great deal of commercial shipping after the War of 1812 ended on the Great Lakes. That put an end to military activity on the lakes, but commercial shipping flourished, and there's several reasons for that. There were no other ways to reach the center of the continent. The St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes was the highway to the center of North America, to the heart of North America, and it remains so to this day, of course. These schooners, typically 2, 3-masted, there were some 4-masted schooners, were the preferred rig of sailing cargo vessels on the lakes because they were a lot handier on the narrow lakes and with sudden storms and squalls, a lot easier to manage with smaller crews than the square riggers were. But they were substantial vessels. These are roughly the same size as the Blue Nose is, 130 feet, 140 feet long, 20 or 30 feet wide. And if you keep that in mind, you'll see in a couple of these pictures the size of these ships, which is a little bit hard to grasp for those of us yachties anyway. So by 1867, the year of Confederation, by 1867, there were at least 2,000 of these wooden schooners sailing the Great Lakes every season. The numbers went up and down, but I think, from what I understand, the peak of the sailing, at least, wooden schooners was about a little past the middle of the century after the American Civil War. And this is, as the cover photo showed, this is one of our sea cooks, Mrs. Frances Shaver, and a typical crew, scruffy looking bunch, except the captain. He looks like me. So typically these schooners, Blue Nose had a crew of 20 plus, 22, because they had to go out and fish in the dories. And there was a schooner, but a very different kind of schooner. So these sailing vessels had very small crews of typically 4 or 5, and certainly 10 or less. And as you can see, a woman was one of them, and this is unusual. It was particularly unusual because women were known to be dangerous on the ocean. Today, just 1.2% of all the commercial maritime crews are female. The Royal Canadian Navy is a little bit better than that. It has about 20% or more of female crews and officers. But there are historic prejudices against women at sea. They're said to cause trouble. And some of the trouble, of course, is, as you might expect, jealousies among the crew, and distractions from their duties, you might say. But there are other reasons that the classical scholars thought were real. This is a statue of Amphitrite. I put these in so the men don't go asleep. You see this? Amphitrite was the Greek goddess of sailors, and she was married to Poseidon, who was second only to Zeus as the most powerful god in the Greek pantheon, the brother of Zeus. And she was normally quite placid, apparently, but Poseidon was a philanderer, and she finally got irritated with him enough to turn his lover Scylla into a monster out of jealousy. So sailors don't want to make her cross. And they might make her cross by paying attention to other women on the ship, you see. So she might become jealous and then give Poseidon a nudge to raise a storm on that particular schooner. And here's a quote from Pliny the Elder back in the early Common Era. In the first place, hailstorms, whirlwinds, and even lightning can be calmed by a woman uncovering her body while within her monthly courses. Very scary. All men know that to this day. The same with all kinds of tempestuous weather, and out at sea a storm may be lulled by a woman uncovering her body. So this was, of course, convenient for sailors, because then they could put naked women on their bowsprits and admire them while paradoxically being afraid of them while they sailed. So there's one. The men can feast their eyes on this figurehead from the middle. Oh, darn. Sorry. Every one of these.
That's enough about that.
That's good. She got angry with me. Okay, perfect. So, despite this superstition and fear about women sailing aboard, women were always found at sea in one role or another. They could be related to the captain, wives, daughters, sisters, mothers, consorts. Even Nelson took his, the love of his Lady Hamilton was said that their daughter was conceived on one cruise, although Nelson didn't like women aboard either, apparently. The Royal Navy grudgingly tolerated women aboard during the Great Age of Sail. These women became washerwomen aboard, washing their sailors' clothes in fresh water for a fee. And they helped with tailoring. They helped on deck, and they helped in battle hauling ammunition around. So they were fully participating in many ways as women in the Navy. But these were not paid crew. These were allowed aboard grudgingly because it kept the men supposedly happy. And they actually fed them. They fed them 2/3 of a man's, an able-bodied seaman's ration, and they even had their kids aboard in some cases who got fed a half ration. And many of you know that the phrase "a son of a gun" came from this era, from a sailor being born on deck between the guns of a man of war. But they were never part of the paid crew. And this is a striking thing that bears directly on what I'm going to talk about today. Of course, women ashore were always engaged fully in maritime life as wives, family, as hired lighthouse keepers. I think about as many as 30 out of 100, Walter will be able to correct me, on the Great Lakes were women hired to man the lighthouse, so to speak. But as sex workers, tavern owners and servers, ship owners, shipyard owners, but never workers on the ship unless they were disguised as men. And quite a few were. There's some pretty good literature about women going to sea disguised as men and not being discovered for many, many months. One was a shipwright who didn't get discovered until she finally was found in Plymouth working on a vessel ashore. So ashore, women, of course, have always done most of the cooking. And I bet they still do to this day. And they're the keepers of food and cooking knowledge. And so you'd think, consistent with shoreside customs, women aboard would be cooking. It's always been seen as a menial woman's job on a float. And the sailing environment's always been considered a masculine, heroic type of work. But but there were never any female sea cooks on the ocean-going ships. They were exclusively men, but they considered them women. They often were seen as effeminate or homosexual, seen as useless aboard ship as sailors, and they were often older and disabled or habitual drunks, and there are many, many stories about drunk cooks. That's another presentation. I think that's a good one, yeah, for sure. And untrainable, basically, for any other role afloat. But and here's a good quote. I think this is from Alan Villiers. The man who was not good for anything else was the man to cook. And here you see a lovely image of Long John Silver, the world's most famous sea cook, in Treasure Island. And you can see it's a lovely painting of how life in the galley is at sea, with the ship pitching up and him leaning on his crutch in the cupboard and holding the frying pan and the coffee pot level while everything else is on its end. And Minerva, that Michelle, thank you for talking about Minerva. I'll touch base with Minerva McCrimmon, because I think she's probably the most famous real sea cook in history, and she was from Prince Edward County. So there's a lot of research that I did when I first stumbled across this factoid. I wondered about it a lot, and one paper is studied in detail 427 mariners who sailed out of Salem, Massachusetts on cargo ships. In 30 years, a full generation, there were no women, none at all. And these were very much, I think, similar to the kind of businesses that we saw here, family businesses in many cases, where the captain and the crew and the officers all knew each other from the village. Another study looked at sailors in Newfoundland. Just over a decade, there were 4,000 seamen who signed up in Newfoundland, but just 25 women, and they were not cooks. They were stewardesses, which could have been almost anything else, servers, assistants, cooks, assistants, and maids, but not paid cooks. There's another one. A much bigger study of British merchant marine, several thousand ocean-going sea cooks, butchers and bakers in the British merchant marine were studied, where they had records. And that was over 80 years or so, between 1861 and 1938. So a very long time and a very broad study, 0 women. So this was unheard of on the ocean. And there's other anecdotal evidence as well. Alan Villiers, many of you will know, is a famous windjammer sailor, circumnavigated several times, and he wrote about, I think, 44 books about the golden age of sail and the tall ships in the cargo trade sailing around Cape Horn, among other places. And he said that the shipmasters' wives were quite common aboard, but no one else, no other women aboard on those great ships traveling around the world. So there's quite a bit of evidence that says there were no women, but that didn't mean cooking at sea was unimportant. Obviously, the sailors had to eat. And Villiers pointed out that they're often working 24 hours, 4 on, 4 off, and they had to eat quite a lot, and they had to be nourishing food for them to keep up with the demands of blue water seafaring. But the male cooks didn't give them much in the way of good food, although it was nourishing. And he said, well, the shipmasters probably wouldn't have known if it was good food, even if they were fed it in the day when he was sailing. Typically, the sailors lived for months on salt horse, barreled salt pork, salt beef, sometimes years old in the barrel, combined with pea soup. Dried peas, of course, and salt pork and beef are well preserved for months-long ocean voyages. And there are some sailors, Villiers had to admit that they came to see that as normal food, and some even preferred it once they got ashore and retired. They would keep eating salt horse and pea soup. So there was not much in the way of gourmet dining aboard on these working ships. And by the early 20th century, the incompetence of these male sea cooks had reached alarming levels, such that the ship owners were finding it very difficult to attract crew. The food was reputed to be so bad on some of the ships. So, of course, ship owners in the late 19th century were very important people in Britain and elsewhere in the West. And they got the attention of Parliament. And there were speeches made. Sea cooks not only deserve our attention, they command it dumbly, but imperiously. And as a necessary enterprise, cooking at sea for only a few or sometimes hundreds of people within the confines of a hull or deckhouse was quite challenging. So, who knew? Who knew? So in 1906, the ship owners persuaded Parliament to pass a law that required a, quote, certified cook on every ship of 1,000 tons or more. Of course, these were all men. And this, of course, meant that sea cook training facilities popped up ashore, and you could buy a certificate, and there was a lot of corruption associated with that, I think. But things carried on with on the saltwater merchant marine with just men cooking, albeit a little bit better trained. And even today, almost no sea cooks on the saltwater merchant marine are women. But that's very different here. Anybody red, green, colorblind? Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, so entirely contrarily, on the Great Lakes, it was a completely reversed situation, and we have lots of evidence, some of which I'll be able to show you today. A fellow, Charles Henry Jeremiah Snyder, is a very famous and revered Canadian maritime historian and artist and journalist. Snyder crewed on the dying end, the last decade or two. He crewed on the Great Lakes schooners and rose to become a mate. Several of the famous ships we might touch on today, he was a mate on. And he says the cook was usually a woman on the Great Lakes. Out of these 2,000 ships every year, usually a female cook. And as if that was we don't have to take his word for it. There's a magistrate, a mariner named J.J. O'Connor, who, when he retired, Snyder interviewed, and he said all the Great Lakes vessels had women cooks in those days, and they were good. So two contrasts with seagoing cooking, for sure. And there's a weather-beaten sailor with his wife, and they're on a schooner. And I just wanted to make sure that nobody got the impression that women signed up to sail on the Great Lakes because it was a much safer place to sail. All of you who have sailed know that this is not true. This is just an example of those lake schooners. This was drawn by Snyder himself, a three-master called Queen of the Lakes, and she was built right here in Portsmouth Harbor, then Hatteras Bay, by Edouard Beaupre. Amanda Ostrander, and Ostrander is a famous name in the county. You go around, there's lots of places that recognize that name there. And she was the wife of the captain. So there's the county, and you see those little dots all around the county. Many of you will have seen this map already, I think. And if I can make this go there. So all these little dots.
There.
Well, there, all those little dots around the shorelines are everyone is a wreck. And it's known that there are over 400 identified wrecks off the coast of Prince Edward County, and there's, I think, 100 around Kingston Harbor, and there are thousands and thousands of wrecks on the Great Lakes all around. So it was a dangerous place to sail, regardless of what the salties think. We all remember the Edmund Fitzgerald, lovely evocative painting of the Fitzgerald just before she went down. 26,000 tons, as big as a great number of ocean-going vessels. And this is Gordon Lightfoot's wonderful ballad, Mourning of Fitzgerald. The skies in November turn gloomy every year, and that's a theme. A lot of these deaths and wrecks were because I showed you a picture of a beautiful day when the grain schooners coming into Kingston Harbor. One of the major cargoes during this period was barley, and barley was only ready for shipping at around the end of October. So these cargo vessels sailed right through into middle of December, right until freeze up every year. And of course, we all know that's the equinoctial storms on the Great Lakes, a very dangerous time to sail on them. Stan Rogers, our maritime poet laureate, has a wonderful song called White Squall about a kid who gets swept off one of the freighters on the Great Lakes. Very, very evocative, well worth getting the album just for that. And he's wearing what they called a schooner cap, and that was a normal dress of those folks, women and men, on the lakes. My friend Megara loaned me this picture she took of Portsmouth Olympic Harbor just a few years ago. So you can imagine one of the places they sailed into, and Nerva McCrimmon did as well, was Oswego, straight across the lake. And Oswego used to get regular surf like this whenever there was a westerly or a northwesterly blowing all the way down the lake. And it would ricochet off the docks at Oswego. And you can see in the background there's a couple of stone piers. And in order to get into the harbor in this terrible weather, you had to sail in between those two stone piers. And you can see just faintly in this picture, there's a big pile of surf going over it, and there's a big 50-foot high piece of surf there. And often these waves, they could feel the backwash off Oswego 5 miles out in the lake. And when they came to turn into that narrow throat of an entrance, often there would be a 50-foot surf that would just heave this 500-ton schooner ashore, just like those two. And sometimes they were able to be hauled off, but other times, like that one on the right, the Baltic, they broke up, and in many cases, their crews were drowned. And of course, the women shared all that hazard. We have very few pictures of any of these women, but the Ballad of Nerva and the Delaware is portrayed in words. And you can Google it. It's well worth looking up. Just Google the Ballad of Nerva and the Delaware and download it or print it. And this is a young woman, late teens, maybe 20, who was a sea cook on her dad's schooner called the David Andrews. And the David Andrews was a very cranky ship. Nobody could sail it in a straight line at all except Nerva. And she had to take control one November blizzard night and sail it in between those piers in Oswego, which she succeeded in doing. And we know this because somebody wrote a ballad about her about 10 years after the event. And it's been verified in several different ways. Nerva was a real person. So she became the second most famous sea cook, but the most famous real sea cook in the world. I won't read all that to you. That's the first stanza, but the yellow bit, the girl, the captain's daughter, the heroine of this tale, and I'm going to tell you of her trick at the wheel, in the wind and the rain and the hail. And this goes on for about 20 verses as as she guides Dave Andrews across Lake Ontario in an equinoctial blizzard. And at the end, I'll read the verse, she's frozen to the wheel. So we don't know how many women, and I think we'll never know how many exactly there were. Even as far back as 1792, Lady Simcoe, the noble wife of the first Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, wrote in her journal that nobody kept any logbooks on the Great Lakes. But we can guess, and I hope you will swallow this line as a reasonable guess. Typical schooner crew in the Great Lakes was anywhere from 3 to 10, depending on the size, depending on what cargo they had, but typically 4 or 5, including a cook. I mentioned there were 2,000 ships each summer on the lakes. So if even only 3/4 of them had cooks on them, that's 1,500 women every summer for 50 years. So that adds up. If there was even a reasonable turnover, there's thousands and thousands of cooks that we know nothing about. And even the literature about the Great Lakes hasn't discovered these. And I think part of the reason for that is a lot of the literature is written before Walter Lewis, who's here tonight and deserves a knighthood, created a database called the Maritime History of the Great Lakes. And you can search that database now by name, by schooner cook, by almost everything. And I sometimes think that I'm probably the first one that's ever searched it for this, because it's all there in the newspaper accounts and in Snyder's writings, for sure. But for sure, these women kept no diaries of their own, at least none that we found today. They were anonymous. Many of them, hundreds of them, died anonymously, are buried in unmarked graves in the lakes. And so this is a bit, I hope, of a commemoration for some of them. I am going to publish a book in this fall, maybe in time for Christmas, that focuses on this. So if you want more of the story, then you'll just have to wait until November or so. So, of course, many of these women were hired crew. I'd hesitate to put a number to it, but let's say half. Anyway, the others were relatives of the skipper and the owner, or a deckhand. There's one famous quote by a deckhand, a male deckhand, whose wife was cook on one of the schooners, and he was quoted, and I paraphrase slightly, as saying that she was a wonderful cook when she wasn't seasick, which she was most of the time on Lake Ontario. So this is a shared risk endeavor. The women are at just as much risk working on these schooners as the men were, and in some cases, as I'll show, extra hazards as well. We don't even know how many died. The records were so poor that in many cases in the newspaper reports, and of course newspapers talk about wrecks, they don't talk about safely arrived and left, at least down to the level of crew names. But the wrecks generally found a little more interest. But most of the, if not most, then a very large number of these women died anonymously. And presumably, if they recovered their bodies, they were buried anonymously too. One researcher that I've read suggests that we don't know how dangerous this trade was. They suggest that as many as 30% of all the male ocean sailors, this is the one sailing out of Salem, much as 30% of them died before they were 30 on the ocean. And another authority on workplace safety said that on the long ocean trips, as many as 10% of the crew were lost on every trip. So this is not a safe workplace, no matter how you cut it. I was intrigued by that. And if you lose 30% before you're 30, that compares well with the casualty rates in the First World War. I think Canada was 8%. The average in the Western Allies was 14% of all the men in the trenches were killed. But it might be even higher if you sailed a tall ship. So my main source of information is the newspaper articles that Walter has made available. And I'm sure I've missed many of them. But also stories like Snyder wrote in his weekly column. As I said, he was a mate on the schooners for 5 years. He retired, became a journalist, and rose to be the managing editor of the Toronto Evening Telegram. And every week for 30 or 40 years, he wrote a column called Schooner Days, and he reminisced about what it was like, and he interviewed people and he interviewed owners. And some of those I've used here that were about the female cooks on the Great Lakes. So here's some typical examples of hundreds of newspaper entries. An unidentified cook died in the wreck of the schooner Augustus. Ford, a woman cook from Buffalo, was lost in the Lake Ontario foundering. The cook, who was the mate's wife, perished with the schooner Eureka, 1901. This is an appalling list that goes on and on and on. This is a postcard from Picton. I can't remember the year, but you'll see on the right the bow of a three-masted schooner, a three and after called the Oliver Mowat, that was built by Mr. Beaupre down at Mill Haven, very famous schooner on the lakes. And you can see the scale of it. You can see that guy sitting under his parasol in the little boat in front. And there are some pictures of kids running up and playing in the bow chains. And so these were substantial vessels, to be sure. And there's what is possibly the last picture taken of the Oliver Mowat. This is 1920 or 21, thanks to Maurice Smith, who sent this one out. And this is right out here. You can see in the background the chimney of the Marine Museum. And somebody might be able to identify that yacht from the Yacht Club right there. And until about 1955, just over here in front of those apartment towers was a pile of coal about 40 feet high that was used to heat and light Kingston. And the Mowat was likely delivering coal to that pile right beside the Yacht Club, 1920 or 21. And the Mowat was, by then, 1873, 50 years old. Wooden ship, 50 years old, been worked hard. You can imagine carrying coal and stone. Bulk cargoes are terrible on the wooden ships, especially old ones. And a lot of them went down without trace because of it. So another woman named Annie Smith, sea cook from near Brighton, drowned at 18 when her schooner went down. In 1888, Mrs. Wright from Oswego, who was known as a zealous worker, supported 2 little kids and likely was a widow. She went down with all hands on the schooner, the Emerald. Many of these were family enterprises, and of course, each one of these tragedies would strike hard ashore. This is one of the most terrible ones. Marion Mackey was 28. She was a cook on a 3 and after that was called Jessie Breck for 2 years. And the Jessie Breck was coming back from up the lake with a load of timber destined for the Calvin Yard on Garden Island. And she capsized and foundered within sight of her home port on Wolf Island. And all aboard drowned, including Marion Mackey, her father Thomas Mackey, two of her brothers, Mackies, and three other crew members from the island all at once, within sight of shore. So these were awful tragedies at the time, of course. This is the Jessie Breck. You can see tucked in beside that big steamer. That's the stern. She was a three-master before she was wrecked, and it seems they had perhaps piled too much lumber on deck, so she became top-heavy, and she capsized, and they were able later to repair her and put her back to work as a barge, but she killed 8 or 9 people. Mrs. Henry Selleck, who lived on the county, first lost her husband by drowning off Main Duck Island, and then 10 years later, her youngest brother, Moses, lost his life in a terrible tragedy, drifting across the lake in a blizzard in an open boat. And then she lost her son, Johnny, when the Emerald went down as well. So these were repetitive, terrible tragedies. The female cook on the Maggie Hunter was never identified positively because the records were no good. And she was her corpse was the only evidence of what had happened to the ship. And they found her, but they couldn't tell from the records whether she was Eliza Kennedy or Miss Ellen or Eliza Cook, shamefully. Elizabeth Kennedy, another similar name, was Cook, and she was the sister of the captain on the Minerva Cook. And when she went ashore on the west side of Prince Edward County near Weller's Bay, in the surf, her brother, with all the best intentions in the world, apparently lashed her to one of the big horses on deck, and they had horses to help them with haul the timber about and load the timber. And she and their horse and their dog were found drowned long time after. Sadly, the only one who died in that wreck. And there's a typical timber schooner broken in the surf, and you can see how difficult it would be to swim through all that floating lumber in a terrible surf. It'd be next to impossible, and there are stories of female cooks getting caught in the cabin, and the cabin being flooded with this lumber poking through it, and dreadful. Mrs. Manette drowned when she was in the yawl boat. They abandoned the ship in their yawl boats, which are the little boats they hung on the davits off the stern, and the yawl boat overturned, trying to get ashore. Emily Phillips, née Shaughnessy of Belleville, was cook and drowned on the Gilbert Mollison. Annie Mills on the Nellie Sherwood, and the female cook unnamed of the brig Alice Grover when it went down. Margaret Miles, one of the sea cooks, she died of exposure after the James Navag went ashore in November, and she clung to the rigging in the freezing surf in November, as you can imagine what that was like, right through the night and most of the next day. And a lifeboat reached her from shore, but on the way back it overturned twice and she just gave up, I think. Who could blame her? And there's one of the wrecked schooners. Very common sight around the lakes. So an unnamed cook on the coal schooner Anna Maria drowned, along with the captain and another crew, and one of the men from the shore boats that tried to reach them through the surf. And that was a 131-foot schooner, wrecked on Lake Huron. Another sea cook, Mrs. Dick, sister to the captain of the schooner Belle Mitchell, went down with her and all the rest of the hands in October 1886. This is the Anna Maria ashore and smashed to pieces. Katie Doe, we don't know her last name, was a sea cook on the George Davis. And through one gale, as they were running down Lake Erie, she kept the crew fed from her stove, but also kept throwing ashes under the feet of the skipper because the water was freezing on deck where he was trying to steer. And when the ashes ran out, she used coal dust to put some grit on the deck. Katie drowned when the schooner was wrecked in a later voyage. And most of the schooners in the late fall carried big barrels of salt that they would scatter in the rigging and scatter on deck to try and keep the rigging from freezing. This is one picture of a wreck. And you can imagine trying to hoist or drop a sail on those boats when the halyards were frozen. And a lot of them came to grief because of that. And this is probably the most horrible story I'll tell tonight. Annie.
Because they've all been so joyful.
Annie Farrington was a young woman from Picton, and she had an infant daughter that she left behind when she went to crew for her husband as cook on his three-masted schooner called the Riverside. In October 1893, the Riverside was last seen picking up a cargo of cut stones in Detroit for delivery, like the Edmund Fitzgerald, headed towards Cleveland, and was lost. Neither schooner nor crew nor any trace of them were ever found. But later, months later, on a beach near Buffalo, there was a bottle found with this message on a brown torn piece of paper in it. Whoever finds this, please write to Mrs. Jane Farrington, South Bay, that the Riverside is full of water and we are all likely to be lost in Lake Erie. Please, Grandma, take care of my baby, for we will all soon be drowned. And the cooks, of course, also faced unique risks of their own. The galleys were often located on deck because they were coal or wood-fired, and there was a big fire hazard on the ships, which are all wood, with rope rigging, and in the early days at least, and linen sails, canvas sails. And it was quite frequent that they'd be overwhelmed, and in this case, the galley, with all its appurtenances, and the small boat and the starboard railing were all washed overboard on this particular schooner. And of course, if they were inside the galley, they'd go overboard with it. Eliza Weatherhead was the only one lost when the schooner Jamaica was hit by a white squall on Lake Huron. And she was trapped in the galley cabin and unable to get out when the schooner capsized. Schooner Wolcott, this is a bit more amusing, rode out a gale. They lost 10 barrels of flour of deck cargo, and the story goes that Captain Stinson said the ship only stayed afloat because barrels of flour broke open, and it made a paste that covered all the cracks in the deck boards. But the galley and the boat were all lost overboard. The cook survived that one. Another one, the schooner Adrian put into Grand River with the boat gone and the galley, etc. It says gone. I don't think that includes the cook. The bulwarks stove in and the vessel waterlogged. So if you have salties brag about how terrible it is on the ocean, you can send her to this trove of real information. So this is typical stoves they worked on. These are the fancy ones, of course. The kinds of stove ranges from at the high end of these sort of luxury models, with some with 2 ovens and rails around, of course, to hold everything on, down to bits of plate that have been bolted together at home and had a layer of sand put in the bottom to cook on. I think I've got one story where that in a storm, the stove came apart while they were sailing. So the unique risks the cooks faced were, of course, as we saw with Long John Silver, you're you're cooking like this, or like that, or like that, all at once. And you have a red hot stove. You have to keep the stove going with coal or wood. And this is all unpredictable. You can't see most of the time what's going on outside. And the galley, of course, could be full of water from deck surf. And the cook often stands in about a foot of water to do their work. And here's one account of the speedwell. All through the night, that cook of ours was up and busy making sandwiches for us. From where I was at the wheel, which is just behind the galley, I could hear her being banged from one side of the galley to the other, sometimes clear across the cabin as the speedwell rolled. There would be a crash of dishes and knives and forks and spoons. Many yachties have experienced that noise, of course. I certainly have. But not the violence of these storms usually. We don't usually get much in the way of descriptions of these women. This is one exception. Cook Louis White was a red-headed lass with a vocabulary to match her galley repertoire. On one voyage, the Carolyn Marsh fell into the trough of the sea and rolled fit to loop the loop. Louis's pots and pans, and these are iron pots and iron frying pans, of course, raised Cain in the galley, and the stove fell to pieces. Louis rolled out of her bunk. She'd been seasick, and we hadn't had a meal since leaving Port Hope by then. So there's a Snyder's drawing of the Carolyn Marsh, a two-master that the lake sailors called a fore and after. And of course, the women aboard, if they weren't crewing on a ship that was owned or had a relative aboard, they suffered abuse, as you can well imagine. So I've got a few examples of this. The beastly intoxicated cabin dragged his poor cook around the deck by her hair and kicked her black and blue, probably because she refused his advances. Mary Lindsay was the cook on the barge Sam Bolton, and she did refuse as well improper proposals. And then he kicked her in a brutal manner and put her out on deck, no doubt in early December for 3 hours. Sea cook Sarah Gordon, and this was in Kingston, was sexually assaulted, beaten, and cut in the face by 4 men who boarded the schooner. I think she was docked downtown, and they locked the mate in his cabin so he couldn't interfere. And 2 of the men were thought to be former crew members who had left the ship in Brockville as she came up the river from Prescott. Mary Gorman was shot to death on the schooner Harvey Bissell in May of 1882, and there was a coroner's inquest that came to a verdict of suicide. She was 25. Oh. And there was quite a bit of journalistic inquiry into this. It seemed to the reporters that this was a most unlikely verdict, that she'd been shot probably by the captain. This one also took place in Kingston, reported in the Whig. Sea cook, she didn't want her name published. American sea cook, 2 lake captains had assaulted her and attempted to rape her in the cabin downtown next to Richardson's grain elevator. But she fought back desperately, and she was savagely beaten and partially throttled. And she screamed loud enough to bring the night watchman from the elevator and 2 crew members who were downtown in one of the bars. And they took her ashore and found a hotel. We don't know what happened to those officers for sure. So, as well as abuse, sexual abuse, they got a course on equal pay. Has anybody heard that before? So, 1878, the male cooks would be paid no more than $30 a month, but females would get only $20 a month in the contracts. 1881, 3 years later, and these wages went up and down every year depending on the state of the business. 1881 from Toronto to Oswego, right down the length of the lake, the female cooks would just earn 66 cents a day, when that's half what the ordinary sailors made. 1882, the men had a union, or two or three, and they met in Kingston and determined that wages would be fixed at $1.50 a day for male cooks and $1 to $1.25 for females. And there was an excuse that they said the male cooks would survive bad weather better. And I've got a few more examples to, illustrate how really foolish that was. And self-serving. Mrs. Joseph Peacock was a sea cook on the Mary Everett in the summer. But in the fall, when the equinoctial storms came along, she was fired and replaced by a man at considerably higher wages. This is the Mary Everett, drawn by Schneider again, another two-master. But there were so many cooks, unlike the ocean, there were so many cooks crewing on the Great Lakes that there began to be some organized resistance to having female cooks aboard. And of course, the male cooks resisted because they were losing jobs. In many cases, crews all preferred female cooks because the cooking was a lot better. But the wives, the onshore wives and girlfriends of captains and officers began to get outraged at the opportunity for sexual dalliance that was given aboard a ship on a 2-week or 3-week cruise or longer from port to port to port. They nicknamed these female cooks calico cooks. And they saw them as a devil of an opportunity for sexual liaison aboard. And this went on for a decade or more and was formalized in 1906. The Marine Cooks and Stewards Union got their employers to agree that women cooks are barred from working on the carrier's ships. The women cannot be depended upon to withstand the effects of stormy weather. And the employers were making the argument that they're better cooks, they're more economical, saving of food, and they protect the supply of dishes. Not to mention they're cheaper hires in the first place, of course. But the union won that struggle. So there were no new cooks after 1906 on those ships. And the Chicago Inter-Ocean was kind of a shipping newspaper, I guess, in Chicago during this period. And they took up this fight against the female cooks as immoral. And this is the Daily News piling on in 1876. The war waged by the Chicago Inter-Ocean against female cooks has borne good fruit. A great many vessel owners have compelled their captains to give up carrying them. And the result is that a higher state of morality will probably prevail in future on the lake schooners. And the editorials around the lakes were so pious. If we were lake underwriters, we should certainly try and put a stop to the practice alluded to of playing and fooling around with the cook. That's about the last thing a captain should be indulging in. And there was this went back and forth up on Lake Erie. And there was even some doggerel written, I think, by one of the reporters who knew whereof he spoke, to north, to south, to west, or to the east, whichever way mine weary eyes may look. Oh, may they never, never cease to feast upon a whiskey shop and a female cook. And here's the Whig piling on, describing a female cook, a positive disgrace to her sex. She drinks and uses language of the foulest character, spent her life on the water as cook, and in that capacity became what she now is. It is about time the journals of respectability should join in a protest against having female cooks on vessels. It's most demoralizing. So, of course, women are not perfect, dare I say it. And there are reports in the newspapers of women overindulging. Go figure. Bridget Deegan was fined, and this is again from Kingston, fined $2 for drunkenness, and she paid that fine. Another woman, Marianne May, was brought up drunk, the third charge of the kind against her during the past 4 days. Cook aboard the schooner, 3 friends, and they sent her down to the cells to get sober enough to receive her sentence. Another drunken cook's fine was paid by her captain, a considerate thing. I won't read any motives into it. And female sea cooks are also known to protect their vessels. They were quite possessive about them, and one anonymous cook made the wig after repelling a thief who attempted to break in when the rest of the crew was ashore. And they also were known to defend others aboard who were even more vulnerable than they were. One unnamed cook from a timber schooner named Albatross rescued a 12-year-old ship's boy from a mate who had thrown him in and then refused to help him climb up a rope back onto the ship. And so the story goes that she gave him a great big slap right across upside the face, and then hauled this kid in all naked and shivering, and brought him into the galley to warm him up. But the mate did not do that again. And here's a lovely drawing of what those horses were doing aboard. There's a great big windlass there with the rope around it. And so they would hitch the other end of that rope onto a big timber 4 feet square. And using the horsepower, they would haul it into the boat and stow it below. And so the horse boy's job was to take care of the horses when they were aboard, and also all sorts of other odd jobs, including helping the cook. Sometimes there were thieves, but this is unusually reported, and never. It doesn't seem there. I never saw any reports of going to court, so this may just have been scapegoating. Captain Coons of the barge Annie Craig in Collins Bay thought to be robbed by the female cook. One cook was arrested in Toronto for forgery, and they did push back. These were, by and large, strong, independent, forceful women. And in that back and forth between the newspapers, there was one anonymous letter signed Calico Cook that came in, and this is just an excerpt from it. I believe, however, that all this hue and cry is made by incompetent male cooks, jealous sweethearts, and overzealous wives who may perhaps need as much looking after as the women whom they see fit to censure and condemn. So they were pushing back. And there was another one, and these are anonymous letters. I think you tell me whether you think this was written by a woman. I'm not an interested party, but I can tell you that female cooks are a great saving to a vessel. The women can cook better and do the work better, and they are not wasteful like men. Isn't a woman cook and waiter much better than a man? I'll leave it to yourself. How would you like to have a greasy, dirty man to do your cooking and wait on your table? So guess the gender. There were no unions to protect them aboard. They tried to organize themselves. These women were on their own, but you can see in many cases they defended themselves fairly well in many cases. In Kingston, another Kingston Whig report, a woman named Turcotte had been hired to cook aboard Feu Follet, and she succeeded in taking a crewman to court for seduction, getting him convicted and fined $200. And at $1 a day, that was quite a significant fine, something close to the entire summer's wage that unfortunate fellow earned. Mary Quinn, a cook on a steam tug, got her vessel seized in Detroit, proved she was owed wages of $92.50, and Another one in Detroit persuaded the deputy United States Marshal to tie up the vessel for owed wages of $9.75, which is probably for a week aboard. They struck once, at least once in Chicago, 1873, to try and get fair wages. And then they tried to organize a union for themselves in Buffalo. I don't think that succeeded at all, but Walter probably would know much better than I. But they were particular about their galleys, and at least one of them defended with arms. The schooner Cornelia arrived in Clayton in October of 1885 with the mate's arm all bandaged up. And this mate had repeatedly tried to hang up his stinky sea boots in the galley. And she took them down and put them on the floor, and he found them and he hung them back up, at which point she took violent exception and attacked him first with an iron tea kettle and then with a carving knife. And he had several slashes on his arm when they came ashore. And this is a lovely photograph of the Cornelia being fore and after, two-masted schooner being towed out of Oswego. And once again, just you can see how big the helmsman is. So these are substantial ships. So of course, have I got still some time?
So you'll hear me.
Okay, I'm going to take that as a yes. So, Sea Cook Jane Hyatt was one of these heroines who was called on deck in a northwest gale. The oil lamp that illuminated the compass in the binnacle right in front of the helmsman had unshipped itself. The storm was so violent, and she was called up to hold this hot oil lamp so the crew could steer a compass course all night. And this is at a time when it took two men on the wheel to wrestle the schooner onto a course. So, when this union was saying, oh, they can't stand up to the foul weather, it's just a joke. And here's a lovely picture. I wish I had a better resolution one. Somebody stole it out of the Toronto archives, sadly. Kitty Schaefer. So does she look like she's in cooking gear? No. She's on the Lyman Davis on deck, her schooner, around 1922, doing some line handling underway. And I probably will come back to the Davis. It was the last of the working schooners on the Great Lakes to survive. So here's one, Mrs. Jones again from Kingston. Kingston was the source of many of these stories in the Whig, and Mrs. Jones came ashore in Oswego and knocked her captain to the deck as they tied up of the schooner Cape Horn with her large iron kettle because he had refused to let her sail the vessel. And then she won a police court case in Oswego, fined the captain $14. So I imagine there must have been a breach of contract when he refused to let her sail the ship. And the Oswego editor says, Mrs. Jones opens an oyster. So witty. Louise Talbot had quite a few articles in the Detroit Free Press. Her crew, she was a 160-foot schooner named Sunshine, and her crew deserted. So she anchored out in the middle of the ship channel, which was quite narrow. And when they interviewed her, she was acting as, she said, captain, mate, engineer, pilot, cook, deckhand, stewardess, crew, everything but owner. And she refused to move the schooner until she got a paid cargo to move it. And so these were women that you didn't want to fool with. They were strong women. So another one, Mrs. Sophia Maud Buckley, née Hepburn, and Hepburn's a famous name in the county as well. Shipped out as a cook after her first husband drowned. And then she married another sea captain, and then he became chronically ill and unable to sail. So she took over his ship, got her master's papers, took over a 139-foot timber schooner called the Fanny Campbell. And Snyder wrote that she shipped another woman as cook and bossed a crew of 6 men and 1 or 2 mates as efficiently as any skipper with side whiskers. She was as quick as a cat and would lay aloft with the watch on the topsail yards if necessary, but mild-mannered and refined and never wore trousers unless the particular job called for oilskins or coveralls. And this is her command, the Fanny Campbell. And I gather from, I haven't seen direct proof, but there's one reference to the Fanny Campbell going overseas and back. I'm not sure under the command of Mrs. Buckley, but she sure skippered that vessel up and down the lakes. Martha Hart, this is a funny story. Martha Hart was a passenger on a steamer. She'd been a sea cook from Oswego for 10 years, and in the middle of the lake at night, the steamer apparently stopped, and nobody could find any of the captain or the crew on deck. And they'd all gone and locked themselves in the saloon or in the mess, and because apparently they'd been navigating by the white light on the shore, but it turned out to be the stern light on a ship going away. So they suddenly realized they were supposed to be in Oswego and they didn't know where they were. So they stopped the engines, and it's a calm night, we'll just drift until daylight. And so Martha took over the helm, and with the assistance of a couple of sailors who thought this was not a good idea, she helmed the SS Hastings all the way to Oswego. So there's another female skipper story that Snyder related. Unfortunately, didn't give us her name, but she was a part owner of a brigantine out of a place called Port Burwell, and her husband was a habitual drunk, and when he was particularly illuminated, she would throw him ashore, and she'd take her son and they'd go off and set sail without him. Another one was Emily Blowers, and she was widowed. When her husband died, she had no income at all, and her husband had owned a small schooner, an old small schooner, and so she moved her family. I think she had 4 kids. Moved them onto the schooner and went stone hooking to pay for food. And some of you know what stone hooking is. This isn't what you think. They would take this little schooner, and they often had a boat called a scow that they would tow, and they'd go along the shoreline east and west of Toronto, and they'd get into the water with these cant hook type things, and they would hoist stone aboard, and then they'd bring it to Toronto and sell it by the ton. So her little boat carried 2 toises. Toise is 10 tons, so carried 20 tons of stone. And she and just one son lifted all that stone from the bottom of the lake into the scow, and then all that stone into the schooner gently, because it's an old wooden schooner, and then sailed it to Toronto, and then hoisted it all up on the dock before she got paid. So a hard way to make a living, but there were quite a few at the time making a living. This is Port Credit, just a little bit west of Toronto. This is what they call the stone hooker fleet. Port Credit was apparently where most of them existed. And you can see the little flat bottom scows that they used to put stone into. Many of these schooners were also pram style bow, flat bow. And we come back to Nerva McCrimmon. True story. Snyder interviewed her aunt, said it's all absolutely true, but of course it didn't make the papers because the first time there was no wreck. When she saved the vessel, So at the end, the Dave Andrews drove like a wild bull straight for those piers in Oswego that I showed you, with a little girl at their wheel, boys, a little thing plucky and thin, with her mother's old gray shawl pinned underneath her chin. And she brought them safely inside because Nerva was probably the only one, and this was acknowledged by several other people in the voluminous records that are online. She was the only one who could make that schooner sail a straight line. There's some funny phrases that it was always trying to turn around and bite the person at the wheel like a cranky horse. And it grounded in every corner of the Bay of Quinte. So it was a bit hard to make a living with that kind of a ship because you're paying tugboat fees. But it got some doggerel written about it as well. You may paint my sides black that were once painted white. You may alter my name if you will. But when at my wheel of a dark stormy night, you'll find I'm the Dave Andrews still. And that's because the first time Nerva brought it into Oswego was not the last time to bring it to Oswego. And the second time was less fortunate. And it went ashore where those two broken schooners I showed you earlier were. But she saved the lives of the crew by demonstrating how to use these rocket rescue lines, zip line as it were, when they were unaccustomed to such things. And the boat wasn't too badly damaged, but the owner sold it immediately. That was enough. That was enough for him. And they renamed that schooner the Delaware. So the poem is called Nerva and the Delaware. And this is a drawing that used to hang in the Oswego Customs officer's office, I think. And that is the Delaware coming in to Oswego Harbor during a blow. And she's partly disabled. She's busted off the jaws in her foregaff, and they made it in safely on that particular trip. But Delaware was never a schooner that made a lot of money. So once Nerva got them in safely alongside the piers, and of course they're coming in under sail, and I remember I was told a story about St. Lawrence 2 doing this. They got an engine problem coming into Portsmouth Olympic Harbor, and so they were coming in under as little sail as possible, but still doing 3 or 4 knots when they passed the breakwater. And you can imagine she's 65 tons and not that big, but they had one chance and they threw a loop out and hooked one of those big bollards you'll see on the coal dock beside the prison there, and brought her all to a halt safely with the water squirting out of all of the hawsers. So that's the way they had to stop them quite often. So here she is, after she's safely tied up alongside, to lift Nerva from the wheel. Frozen hands were bleeding. Her feet she could not feel. Her hair was iced to her back, boys, and it seemed to me a sin, for her mother's old gray shawl was froze underneath her chin. So this is a wonderful ballad about what those women did. Not just cooks, not only cooks. I don't mean just cooks, not only cooks, but expert, in some cases, helmsmen that were better than the men. And so this song, I'll just back up one. Whoops. All I have to do is wave my hand at it. And away it goes. I think am I? Oh, I'm hitting the wrong button, sorry. God, I can't see it. Thank you. Okay, so this song, that Nerva's Ballad, was set to music, and my friend Suzanne Pasternak performed it here at least once or twice, and she sadly passed away this year. But it was sung all over the Great Lakes ports in the late 1890s, and particularly in this place called the Reciprocity Tavern. And the Reciprocity Tavern is in Oswego, and that's it right there, behind behind that tied up schooner between the grain elevators. So Nerva was a real person. She died, unfortunately, after the second exposure. Probably she was at home. She probably got TB or pneumonia. Anyway, she died quite young. But a true story. This is just another picture to show you the size of these ships. You know, that's the mainmast, or the foremast there, with the hoops on it. That's the bowsprit and the jib boom. There's a crewman up there, and this is the companionway down to the forecastle where the crew lived. So they're, you know, I keep saying substantial vessels. Surprising how big they were. This is, I think this is intended to be humorous. This is a dark and stormy night with a sea cook at the wheel. It doesn't say whether it was a woman or not, but this happened on more than one occasion, and they would drive in unable to lower a sail, and she speared one of the buildings on one of the wharfs with the bowsprit. And there are several recorded instances of that happening. So again, more than sea cooks, schooner Amanda was named by the captain and the owner who built her for his 12-year-old daughter, who cooked for him and his 6-man crew. She was a timber schooner. And this is during the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. And they brought a cargo of timber over to Charlotte, which is the port of Rochester. And the crew all deserted. And apparently this was quite common during the war. The Union Army offered a bounty like the King's shilling in another age for those who would sign up to fight the Confederate Army, and then they desert, and then they go back and do it again. Some apparently made quite a bit of money doing this. But sometimes they had to go and serve, of course. Anyway, this Captain Quick got fed up with his crew and decided not to wait for them to desert from the Union Army and come back. So he had some help, hoisted the sails, and set off across the lake to, I think, Weller's Bay or somewhere on the west side of Prince Edward County. And he had left his 12-year-old daughter at the wheel, and the wheel was probably as tall as she was. And he handled the sails. And the story goes that when he got back to the dock in Canada, the customs officer came along and noticed that there wasn't any crew. And so it's reported that Captain Quick said, "That little lass there is all 6 of them." And that's a picture of Amanda at 12, and then Amanda at 73, I think. I'm sorry for the quality of many of these. These are from newspapers. And finding the originals of many of these is a chore that's beyond me right now. So this all came to a rather sudden end, sadly, in 1890. And a few schooners managed to straggle on. The Oliver Mowat was one of those who carried on until she was run down at sea by a steamer in 1922, and her sea cook was lost along with the captain. The last wooden schooner in the lakes was built in Schmo Bay across the lake, 1892. So the era ended suddenly, and that was partly because something called the McKinley Tariff. And we're all, tariffs, we're all very familiar with these days. Well, this is a wonderful story that in leading up the election of 1890 in the United States, a fellow named McKinley proposed a tariff because there have been a lot of complaints from Midwestern farmers about unfair competition from Canada. And it was true, the Canadians made out like bandits for 30 or 40 years during what was called reciprocity, free trade. We had a better product, and we charged higher money for it, higher prices for it too. Anyway, so the Midwestern farmers and brewers convinced McKinley that he should put an import tariff on, which he did in October the 1st or October the 7th of 1890, 50% tariff on all imported agricultural goods, including horses. So the trade stopped. The price of barley, for one, which is one of the major crops, perhaps probably the major crop, dropped from $1.25 a bushel to 50 cents in 2 hours. Some of them, one of them said, before we'd filled the schooner up, it went from $1.25 to 50 cents. They said some barley barons, as it were, committed suicide because of it. But that was the basically more than coincidental end of the wooden ships and iron women on the Great Lakes. Some did hire on the steamers, and there are a few to this day. This is one of those other very rare pictures of a cook down in the engine room of one of those steamers. Now, she had a boyfriend protecting her who's very possessively holding on tight among that gang of the dark black gang in the steamer's engine room. But generally, they stopped hiring female cooks who all went back home into oblivion. And I'll just wrap this up by talking a bit more about Kitty Schaefer, who's there smiling into the camera in her oilskins, in charge on deck of the Lyman Davis, which is the last of the Great Lakes schooners. That's a picture of her, photograph, 1906. She was by then halfway through her life. She was 30 years old. By then, some considered her the fastest schooner, but they said that just about all of them, I think, at one time or another, particularly when they were new. So a two-masted schooner, 123 feet long. And in 1933, that was her last year of work. During the middle of the Great Depression, yes. So there's a record of her still working 1931. We don't know if Kitty was still aboard, but she picked up coal in Oswego, and that's basically what most of these ships were relegated to by then. She was a very frequent sight in Kingston and Napanee. She overwintered in Picton more than once, and she would come up the river in Napanee, the Napanee River, and some of you have sailed up there, I bet. And so she's 123 feet long, and how wide? 20? Oh, it doesn't say. Anyway, 30 feet wide, 10 meters wide probably. And I remember reading one account of coming up the Napanee River in the 20s. And by then they had outboard motors. So there was a crew of 2 or 3. And the master would get out and start up his old outboard, and they would tow her up the river right to the bridge. And take on typically lumber then to sell in Oswego. And I remember them saying, you can see the cross yard there with these 2 Rafis, very distinctive Great Lakes sails. They had to turn the cross yard sideways to get up the river so it didn't catch on the branches on both sides of the river as they went up. So a very familiar sight all around here. And in 1933, she was sold, and a Kingstonian was her last owner while she was working, Henry Darya. She was sold to an entertainment company in Toronto, 1933, and there she is awaiting her fate at Sunnyside Beach in Toronto. And Snyder launched a big campaign to try and save her, but he couldn't. And 1934, I had organized a commemorative trip of the St. Lawrence II up the Napanee River to commemorate the burning of the Davis. So she burned in front of 250,000 people in 1934 as a spectacle. Fireworks in the rigging, they bought tickets, and she burned to the water line and then drifted out past Toronto Island, and you can dive on her till today. The stern board still says Lyman M. Davis on that ship. But it frustrates me and many others who love Canadian history and love maritime history and think it's some of the most important history in the world. And I think, you know, these thousands of women I talked about this evening are unique in the world. There were no cooks like them anywhere else in the world except the Great Lakes. Many dozens drowned and are in unmarked graves on the lakes. And of course, as you've seen, as I hope I've told you, these women were very competent sailors, helmsmen, and were held back by societal forces beyond their control, courageous and gritty. Some of them were heroes, and it's been my privilege to tell you their stories tonight. Thank you. So if we haven't run out of time,
now's your chance for any questions. I know there's one from the screen, but if I could just ask you to repeat any questions that we get from the audience, please.
for sure.
Anyone in the room? No, sorry, Walter.
It's okay. Not a question, an observation. Jerry Snyder's negatives are in the archives of Ontario. There are over 1,000 of them. There is a good chance that you can print from those last plate negatives that some of those pictures were duplicated onto.
Wonderful.
So
Wonderful. Well, it's interesting you say that, Walter, because I hadn't figured out that they were all archives from the Toronto Telegram, I guess,
yes,
in some ways. And that one of Kitty Schaefer, though, has been published 3 or 4 times. It was published in the very first Jib Gems, a freshwater journal that was published by the Marine Museum here. And then it was published again by a well-known female maritime historian in the States called Victoria Brehm, I think is how you pronounce her name, Brehm. And I contacted both the author of that paper in Freshwater Journal of the Marine Museum and Victoria, and tracked it down into the Toronto archives, as you say, and bullied and badgered them to go and find this particular negative or print, and it's gone. Somebody's taken it out and not replaced it. Yeah.
David, I have a letter for you to read. It's from the daughter of Kitty Schaefer,
Oh, really? Wonderful.
who I met in person, and she spent the first 6 summers of her life on the deck of the Lyman M. Davis.
Ah,
She said people in the little ports thought she was crazy. As soon as this schooner got to the dock, she would jump off onto the dock and run as fast as she could to the first patch of tall grass that she could find and roll in it.
yeah, sorry. I had a comment rather than a question that there's a letter extant written by Kitty Schaefer, who was the cook on the Lyman Davis, who relates what it was like. They thought she was crazy when she shipped aboard, and she would go when she got in and run as quick as she could to roll in the grass. And I'm assuming that's because she wanted to kiss the ground.
No, it was from the daughter, not that it was actually her daughter that was still alive some 40 years ago.
So her daughter.
It was the little child that had nothing but wooden decks to run around.
Oh, right.
So she missed anything green.
She missed the ground and the grass.
So there's questions from online. Are there any pictures or stories of the Eliza Fisher named after brewer James Fisher's daughter Eliza?
Well, there are, yes. The question was, are there any pictures or stories about the Eliza Fisher? And yes, I have seen pictures of the Eliza Fisher. It was quite common for shipbuilders and captains and owners to name these ships after their daughters and sisters and wives. I don't think I'm familiar exactly with the Eliza Fisher itself, but she's a well-known schooner for sure.
That's something we can call to find on Walter's site.
Walter?
Maybe.
The fishers certainly shows up on the site. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So there are, if you go to the Maritime History of the Great Lakes website, and a marvelous search engine, go to the search engine, type in Eliza Fisher, and boom, it'll come right up. He deserves a medal.
Any other questions?
Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, David. That was wonderful. Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation, David. I thought I'd bring it a little more into the present where, no, they might not be the wooden schooners that David's been telling us about all evening, but the Keewatin is a schooner. It's an Edwardian schooner, and actually had 3 female crew members, stewardesses on board. So it's a continuation of that story, I think. And actually, we're looking for anyone who has connections with anyone who may have been a stewardess on one of those vessels, because it's an area that we recognize is missing, and we want to be able to fill that gap. We have lots of people who have come forward as a former waiter or watchman or stoker, but the stewardesses are one area that we're desperately looking for stories from. So if you have any connections, please put that out into the Great Lakes verse and far beyond to see if hopefully we can start piecing together some of those stories. Otherwise, go ahead.
I have one thing that I would be
right.
remiss in not mentioning. Some of you will know that I took a position as a tour guide on the Island Queen last summer. Great time, made some good friends, new shipmates. But I should point out that one of the captains of the Island Queen is a young woman named Gillian Moran, who is the master of that vessel.
Excellent. There we go. So for anyone who's interested, our next presentation is on March 6th, and it's with Duncan McDowell, and the presentation is HMCS Peakbell. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, and it's Kingston's Little Ship That Could. So that particular ship was built at the Kingston shipyard, and so we're very much looking forward to seeing where that ship ended up, what the story was, and hopefully you can join us on the 6th of March. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening.